Today we take for granted that our cars run safely, our medicines go through years of testing, and our food isn't lethal. But jump back in time and you'll find scientists cutting corners in ways that sound more like dares than research. The bizarre truth: without those questionable choices, the modern safety systems of today might not exist. So what does drinking chemicals, infecting patients, and conducting experiments that would horrify any ethics board have to do with your daily life today? Let's find out. The Poison Squad, eating dangerously. Imagine signing up for a government program where the only requirement is that you eat 3 meals a day. Sounds like a decent deal until you realize those meals come with a secret ingredient: poison. That was the reality for a small group of young men known as the Poison Squad in the early 1900s. They weren't sneaking sips of liquor during Prohibition or taste-testing bold new recipes. They were eating food laced with chemicals most of us wouldn't touch even with gloves on. This wasn't some underground stunt either. It was fully approved research run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Volunteers literally became human test subjects to reveal what was safe, what could make you sick, and what might eventually kill you. The menu didn't look unusual at first glance. There was bread, butter, vegetables, and meat. But baked into those everyday foods were additives like formaldehyde, borax, salicylic acid, and copper sulfate. Today, you might know borax as something that sits under your sink as a cleaning agent. Back then, it was mixed into sausage or sprinkled over meat to make it look firmer and fresher. Formaldehyde, the same chemical used in embalming fluid, kept milk from spoiling too quickly. Copper sulfate gave vegetables a vivid, healthy green color. These additives weren't trace amounts either. They were served in doses large enough to test human endurance. If you were unlucky, your butter came with borax. Your milk arrived preserved with formaldehyde, and your peas glowed unnaturally thanks to a little copper dust. Every plate at that dining hall was essentially a gamble. The men didn't just eat and walk away. They were watched closely, their weight and vitals recorded, urine samples collected, bowel movements tallied, and physical symptoms noted day after day. And the symptoms were not small inconveniences. Volunteers complained of pounding headaches, nausea that lasted through the night, stomach pains after meals, and diarrhea so severe that some had to leave the program. Others talked about trouble sleeping, pounding heartbeats, or skin irritation. Food that was supposed to keep them strong and nourished was literally wearing them down. The trial may have looked controlled on paper, but the bodies of the participants became the true measuring sticks of toxicity. What makes the whole project even more startling today is that the science behind it wasn't very precise. Doses were inconsistent, measurements weren't carefully standardized, and sample sizes were laughably small. The dozen or so men who volunteered formed the entire data set for these groundbreaking experiments. If someone became violently ill after eating chemically treated meat, that result was taken as a sign something must be wrong in general. But if others made it a few weeks without collapsing, that was considered evidence the additive might not be so bad. It was science conducted with brave volunteers but shaky methods. Yet, in an era without rules demanding safety testing or ingredient labels, this crude experiment was revolutionary. The risk those men took reshaped food law in America. Until then, companies could disguise rotting meat with chemicals and sell milk riddled with formaldehyde without breaking any rules. The Poison Squad showed the cost of letting the food industry regulate itself. Their suffering built the case for the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, a direct ancestor of what would eventually become the Food and Drug Administration. Put simply, if you've ever picked up a package in the grocery store and seen a clean, accurate ingredient label, you have these early human test subjects to thank. They were unwitting pioneers who endured pain to prove that people had a right to eat without guessing what hidden toxin was in their dinner. Of course, that recognition doesn't erase the human cost. These were not wealthy men with endless safety nets. They were mostly young government clerks lured by the promise of free meals, steady housing, and small stipends. No one fully told them the long-term risks because no one knew them. They signed up for what they thought would be a year of good meals, maybe some unusual medical checkups, and instead found themselves battling exhaustion and cramping stomachs night after night. Some had to quit. Others stayed because the deal was too tempting to walk away from in those times. The balancing act between survival, opportunity, and health was stacked against them. Looking back, the absurdity is hard to miss. Imagine a government ad today saying, "Eat 3 free meals with us, but we'll secretly add industrial chemicals to see if you can survive." You would scroll past instantly. No ethics review board would even allow the proposal to hit a meeting agenda. We have clear laws and strict safety standards now for a reason. Yet at the start of the 20th century, establishing those protections required throwing human beings directly into harm's way. The poison squad was not an accident. It was a deliberate plan to settle debates about purity in food, and the only way officials knew how was trial by ingestion. So much of what we now consider ordinary, expiration dates, banned additives, regulated preservatives, sprang from this dangerous chapter. It is disturbing to realize food safety in America began not with a careful plan, but with a group of men basically acting as state-sponsored taste testers of poison. Their reckless meals ignited public outrage, pressure on lawmakers, and the creation of modern consumer protection. Every time you buy packaged food without wondering if it hides embalming fluid, you're benefiting from the scars, sleepless nights, and ruined stomachs of those forgotten volunteers. For all the serious consequences, it's hard not to smile a little at the thought of someone today willingly enrolling in a poison diet. You'd have to imagine the sign-up sheet in a break room. Wanted, volunteers to eat detergent-filled steak and glowing green beans. Pay includes room, board, and frequent vomiting. Even in an age when people will try just about any bizarre challenge for the internet, this one would have no takers. That sense of how absurd the scheme looks to us now is exactly what highlights how desperate the situation was back then. People truly didn't know what they were buying at butcher shops or dairies, and the poison squad was one of the only tools to expose the problem publicly. And as extreme as it was, this was only the start. The early 20th century kept producing experiments that feel unthinkable today, except they weren't just proposed, they were carried out. The poison squad proved that governments could shape safety laws by deliberately endangering volunteers. And soon, scientists would start promoting something even more dangerous, not hidden in food this time, but sold openly as a miracle for health. What happens when people decide that glowing bones and radioactive water are the ultimate wellness trend? That's the next strange story. Radiation for health, glowing with regret. In the early 1900s, there was a strange obsession with radioactivity that seems almost unbelievable now. At the time, radium and uranium were still new discoveries, glowing substances that promised energy and vitality. Instead of quarantining them behind sealed doors and thick lead shields, companies turned them into health products. People bought bottles of water infused with radium, pills laced with uranium, and even cosmetics designed to make skin radiantly healthy. There were toothpaste that claimed to whiten with radium, chocolate bars containing small amounts of radioactive salts, and bottled tonics marketed as guaranteed cures for fatigue. The attitude was that if a glowing substance could illuminate the night, maybe it could brighten the human body too. For many, these radioactive products were not cheap tonics sold in street markets. They were luxuries reserved for the wealthy who believed that money could purchase modern vitality. Wealthy businessmen or social elites sipped glasses of radium water each morning, convinced that the glow would invigorate them, sharpen their energy, and even add years to their lives. Drinking a radioactive tonic became a kind of performance, proof that you were up to date with science and not afraid to embrace the most modern treatments available. At first, the users reported feeling energized, but that small burst came at a terrible cost. Over time, their teeth loosened or fell out, their bones weakened, and their health degraded in ways no one could explain at the time. What many thought was a miracle cure turned out to be slow poisoning that ate away from within. The most famous tragedies came not from elite dining rooms, but from factory floors. Young women were hired in large numbers to paint watch dials with luminous paint. These factory workers were trained to make their paintbrushes sharp by licking the tips before applying neat strokes, because the company told them the paint was harmless. They repeated this motion hundreds of times a day. Dip into paint, press brush to lips, apply glowing numbers onto the watch faces. The paint contained radium, and every lick delivered a small dose of radioactive material directly into their bodies. At first, the effects were subtle, but after months and years, the workers began to experience devastating health breakdowns. Teeth would ache and fall out entirely. Jawbones developed infections so severe that entire sections disintegrated, a condition later called radium jaw. Open sores developed that would not heal, while fragile bones cracked under ordinary pressure. Some of the women developed aggressive cancers of the bone and other organs. The glowing paint that once seemed like a harmless industrial innovation had in fact turned their own bodies into radioactive containers, destroying tissue from the inside out. These women became known as the Radium Girls. Their suffering forced the public to face a question that industry leaders had tried to ignore. When do modern breakthroughs cross into outright danger? For years, the companies responsible for the pain dismissed the illnesses as coincidences, blaming poor personal hygiene or unrelated sickness. But as more workers fell ill, patterns became impossible to deny. Desperate, the affected women began legal battles that would drag on for years. Their lawsuits were grueling, not only because of the courtroom resistance from powerful corporations, but also because each plaintiff was already gravely ill. Many testified while literally wasting away from radioactive exposure, their health visibly deteriorating as they fought to be heard. The outcome of their struggle was profound. Although many of the women did not live long enough to see the change, their cases created the first legal protections for workplace safety in America. For the first time, companies were held accountable for exposing workers to dangerous substances. The Radium Girl sacrifices highlighted the need for mandatory safety equipment, protective guidelines, and clear regulations around hazardous materials. Their experiences also helped inspire the eventual creation of agencies dedicated to protecting workers, ensuring that future employees would not have to choose between earning pay and sacrificing their health. The broader culture also shifted. Not long after, radium tonics and radioactive pills vanished from pharmacy shelves, partly because consumers could not ignore the growing scandals, and partly because regulators finally intervened. The same element that had once been marketed as a miracle booster was now recognized as a source of horrific suffering. Public trust swung the other way, from embracing radiation in every product to demanding strict controls on medical and industrial uses. The enthusiasm for a glowing health had literally burned itself out. Radiation, of course, did not disappear. Instead, its uses transformed. The very substance once pitched as a way to energize your blood became a highly managed technology in medicine. X-rays, targeted radiation therapy for cancer, and precise imaging techniques grew out of this dangerous past. Doctors now use radiation in life-saving treatments, but the dose is measured carefully, exposure is minimized, and safety protocols are rigorous. What was once sprinkled casually into toothpaste now requires entire facilities flooded with lead shielding and a battalion of technicians monitoring every beam. The shift from glowing toothpaste to oncology wards is one of the most dramatic examples of how science learned painfully that enthusiasm cannot replace caution. Looking back, some of the marketing claims are almost darkly comic. Advertisements implied that drinking radium-filled tonics would make you powerful, youthful, even virile. The irony is that many of the people who consumed those products lost teeth, collapsed bones, and died far younger than they otherwise would have. People quite literally believed that glowing bones were a sign of wellness. They were not. It was the opposite, a warning bell that their cells were being shredded from the inside. But as grim as the era of radiation tonics and glowing factories was, it forced society to accept that scientific progress could not operate without rules. The random enthusiasm for radioactive cures directly gave rise to radiological safety standards. Gradually, practices like controlled dosage, shielding, and regular health monitoring became the norms, not the exceptions. Standards that are now routine, like workplace inspections and protective gear for handling radiation, trace back to these painful lessons. Agencies like OSHA and international radiological commissions were partly born from the fact that human bones came to glow before society accepted that safety was not negotiable. So Radiation Story is one of contradiction. It began as a novelty, turned into a source of tragedy, and ended up fueling both medical treatments and workplace protections. The early decades of abuse revealed the price of ignoring risk, and the Radium Girls, though they may not have chosen it, became central figures in forcing the change. Their legacy is invisible but powerful. Every precaution taken in modern radiology carries echoes of their suffering. And the dangers weren't limited just to unlucky workers or eccentric elites sipping radium at breakfast. The same eagerness to test the boundaries of science sometimes stretched out far beyond individuals, reaching into entire neighborhoods and even entire cities. When experiments could no longer be confined to a few volunteers, whole communities became the stage for reckless ideas. That's where the story goes next. Human guinea pigs in medicine. When we think about medical research today, the image is usually a white-coated team running years-long trials with thousands of participants, each one carefully briefed and tracked at every stage. Checkboxes, risk disclosures, endless consent pages, boring but reassuring. But the reason it looks like that now is because for much of history, experiments treated human beings as tools rather than partners. Before modern ethics codes, it was common for scientists to test new drugs, vaccines, and procedures directly on vulnerable people with little explanation and no real choice in the matter. Some early attempts at advancing medicine were no safer than gambling with human lives, and often those chosen to volunteer were prisoners, institutionalized children, or communities locked out of equal protections. One notorious pattern was the use of prisoners. In the mid-20th century, some correctional systems allowed pharmaceutical companies or government agencies to run trials inside prison walls. The logic was that incarcerated men were available and under supervision, which made follow-up easy and escape unlikely. But the reality was that consent was questionable at best. People were offered small privileges, better food, early parole hearings, a few dollars a day, to risk their health for drugs that hadn't been tested. It was easy to present these trials as opportunities for self-improvement, but the power imbalance made actual choice almost impossible. In some cases, prisoners exposed themselves to repeated infections, skin-blistering chemicals, or experimental vaccines without any long-term knowledge of what the consequences might be. Wartime only intensified this approach. During World War II, governments were desperate to prevent disease from wiping out troops. Malaria, syphilis, and other infections spread faster than bullets in some battle zones. To find treatments quickly, authorities turned to available populations, often prisoners or psychiatric patients. With malaria, subjects were intentionally infected by mosquito bites or injections, then treated with drugs to see what worked. For those infected, the fever, chills, and weeks of exhaustion weren't side effects. They were the deliberate goal of the study. The medical officers running these trials might have argued it was for the greater good of the military effort, but the people actually carrying the parasites in their blood had no power to refuse. One of the darkest examples in peacetime was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which began in the 1930s and ran for decades. Hundreds of African-American men with syphilis were enrolled under false pretenses. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, but the real purpose was to watch the natural progression of the disease. No full explanation was given, and when penicillin became a standard cure in the 1940s, the men were deliberately denied that treatment. Over time, participants grew sicker, their families were affected, and many died, not because medicine lacked a solution, but because doctors running the study wanted more data from untreated cases. The sheer length of that project and its deception ripped open trust between vulnerable communities and public health institutions, a wound that took generations to even begin repairing. Children, too, were caught in these practices. The Willowbrook hepatitis study in the mid-20th century involved deliberately infecting kids in residential institutions under the claim that exposure was inevitable anyway. Parents were pressed to sign forms to admit their children, often without clear alternatives or explanations of what infection actually meant. The result was years of physical suffering, no real benefit to those who participated, and a lesson that vulnerability itself had been targeted deliberately by researchers. The studies were defended at the time as medical necessities, but they used the weakest protections as breeding grounds for human testing. What tied all these cases together was exploitation framed as progress. Experiments looked like opportunities on paper, free treatment, extra pay, or access to medical care. But in reality, they forced individuals to carry most of the suffering so that society could learn. This pattern eventually collided with global outrage when Nazi doctors in concentration camps carried out even more extreme versions, freezing prisoners alive, infecting them with diseases, subjecting them to surgeries and sterilizations without anesthesia, all with no expectation of survival. These horrors were broadcast to the world after the war, and for the first time there was serious momentum to set rules and enforce them. The first of those rules came in the form of the Nuremberg Code in 1947, which put voluntary consent at the very center of ethical medical work. Participation had to be informed, and no one could be forced into testing without clear understanding and choice. That may sound obvious, but until then it had never been formalized. Decades later, new scandals like Tuskegee added further weight, leading to the National Research Act in 1974 in the United States and the drafting of the Belmont Report. That document laid out 3 lasting principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. In simple terms, people must be told the truth, experiments must seek to do good without avoidable harm, and research should never unfairly burden one group while others enjoy the benefits. By 2025, these ideas turn into the systems we're now accustomed to. A modern drug or vaccine trial takes years, passes through many independent review boards, and demands layer after layer of informed consent. Every participant must know the purpose of the test, the risk involved, and the possibility that they might receive a placebo. Entire committees weigh whether the potential benefits justify the exposures. Instead of scientists quietly making judgment calls, thousands of pages of regulation guide each step. These processes are slow and costly, but they exist to keep history's abuses from repeating. No one can be dosed without approval, no prisoner can be told they have to participate, and no child can be entered into research without careful protections and oversight. The irony is that filling out health consent forms today makes many people sigh or complain about wasted time. But that inconvenience is the direct outcome of decades of misconduct. Next time you scribble your name on yet another medical form, remember that it represents the lives and struggles of countless people who never had those protections. Those redundant explanations about possible side effects, privacy guarantees, and withdrawal rights look like legal clutter, but they are monuments in miniature to history's worst lessons. In the end, the greatest benefit of these unethical studies was not the questionable data they produce, it was the ethical frameworks they force into existence. The sacrifices, whether inflicted in wartime laboratories or civilian institutions, became catalysts for international standards like the Declaration of Helsinki and national frameworks like the Belmont Report. Modern volunteers now enter research with rights, with oversight, and with the guarantee that their consent truly matters. That shift might not bring back lives lost in Tuskegee, Willowbrook, or wartime barracks, but it does offer a safeguard for every new study, every trial drug, and every potential cure moving forward. And the story isn't always about cruelty or negligence. Sometimes breakthroughs came not through deliberate trial, but through sheer accident, a spilled culture plate, a contaminated dish, or a messy bench forgotten over the weekend. Those small slips in the lab led to one of the most important medical revolutions in history. What started as fungus eating into a scientist's experiment ended up saving millions of lives worldwide. That story is coming next. Penicillin, the mold that saved the world. It's hard to imagine one of the greatest medical discoveries of all time, starting with nothing more than a scientist forgetting to clean up his desk. That's exactly how penicillin entered the story of modern healthcare. A contaminated petri dish, a careless moment, and an accidental discovery that would rewrite the odds of survival for almost every human being alive today. In 1928, Alexander Fleming at St. Mary's Hospital in London noticed something strange. Among the cultures he had left out, one was spoiled. A mold had crept in, and instead of ruining the experiment completely, it created a halo where bacteria wouldn't grow. That mold, later recognized as Penicillium notatum, was producing something that stopped bacterial growth in its tracks. By chance, Fleming was looking at the first antibiotic in history. The irony is that the finding didn't immediately trigger excitement. Fleming published his results, but in 1929 little attention was paid. The methods weren't perfected, the substance wasn't purified, and many scientists thought it was just another laboratory oddity. The mold culture producing penicillin was sensitive, unreliable, and often died out before it could be studied. Had the right people not pushed further, the discovery might have stayed in dusty journals. It took years before others like Howard Florey and Ernst Chain found ways to extract and mass-produce the active compound, turning Fleming's small note about a spoiled dish into a treatment capable of saving lives. Before antibiotics, infections were one of life's most constant threats. A child scraping a knee could die from blood poisoning within days. Pneumonia often meant a deathbed, and sepsis from childbirth or surgery all too often had no remedy. Doctors had little in their arsenal other than supportive care, disinfectants on wounds, and good fortune. Simple bacterial invasions were some of the greatest killers of the human species, leading to extraordinary mortality rates from what we consider minor ailments today. That world was the backdrop against which penicillin appeared. The difference it made is almost impossible to overstate. It transformed infections from inevitable killers into curable problems. The human cost of ignoring this discovery was clear before the war, but it was World War II that forced the world to pay attention. Soldiers weren't just in danger from bullets or bombs. Dirty shrapnel wounds, gangrene, and chest infections wiped out countless men even if they survived their initial injuries. The war created an urgent need for antibiotics, and governments invested massive resources into scaling production. Teams in Britain and the United States set up industrial facilities while pharmaceutical companies developed methods to culture the mold on an unprecedented scale. The result was penicillin rolling out to front lines in military hospitals, dramatically reducing losses from infected war wounds. Soldiers who would once have limped back to camp only to die days later were now recovering and returning home. The difference was striking. By the end of the war, penicillin had saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and its reputation was cemented as medicine's miracle drug. From then on, antibiotics spread quickly into civilian use. Pneumonia, meningitis, and septicemia could finally be treated, changing medical survival charts overnight. Average life expectancy rose, not because people stopped getting infections, but because they stopped dying from them so often. This wasn't just a medical shift, it was a social one. Surgery, childbirth, and emergency medicine all became safer, opening the door to modern hospital care as we know it today. Looking at 2025, antibiotics remain the backbone of healthcare. They're prescribed for everything from urinary tract infections to life-threatening sepsis, and they prevent millions of deaths each year. What was once exotic mold juice has become ordinary tablets and injections, stocked in clinics everywhere. The biggest difference is that their very success has created a new problem: resistance. The same evolutionary forces that allow bacteria to survive in harsh conditions now push them to adapt against antibiotics. Decades of overuse, whether from unnecessary prescriptions or the use of antibiotics in agriculture, have produced strains that survive doses once considered powerful. Infections that used to be trivial can now defy treatment, stretching hospital stays and increasing death rates. This resistance is one of the major public health challenges of 2025. Doctors must weigh their prescriptions carefully, balancing immediate relief against the long-term threat of rendering antibiotics useless. Health systems worldwide have begun pushing stewardship campaigns, guiding both professionals and patients away from misuse. Meanwhile, research into new antibiotics is expensive, slow, and often underfunded. The irony is sharp. The same drug that freed humanity from the constant terror of infection could, through our carelessness, become weaker by the decade. Fleming himself had warned of this possibility years after his discovery gained recognition, but it has taken nearly a century for the warning to become urgent at a global scale. Still, there's no denying how far that accident carried humanity. A streak of mold on an untidy plate, nearly brushed off as contamination, has saved countless lives and continues to underpin everyday medical care. Penicillin also inspired a whole family of antibiotics, from amoxicillin to meticulously, that expanded the range of bacteria doctors could treat. The success of penicillin created momentum for immunology and pharmacology, fueling vaccine programs, advanced drug development, and new surgical practices. It was a springboard for modern infectious disease medicine, shaping fields and policies far beyond its moldy beginnings. It's almost funny in retrospect to think that a messy bench solved one of history's greatest killers. Scientists are often portrayed as precise, controlled, and orderly, but in this case, this organization gave the world its most important drug. You could say penicillin proved that an untidy desk can be a global lifesaver. Still, that messy accident would have faded into obscurity without the persistence of scientists who followed it up. The breakthrough wasn't just luck. It was the choice to chase an unexpected clue and build it into a working treatment. Discoveries like this remind us that science is less a straight path forward and more a careful mix of skill, serendipity, and persistence. From that scrap of mold, humanity gained the power to treat infections that once defined our lifespans. And while we now fight to preserve that power against resistance, the story of penicillin remains a defining moment of hope and possibility. One accidental observation altered every hospital, every battlefield, and every home in the world. It's hard to imagine more impact coming from less. And this was only one kind of revolution. Medicine wasn't the only field being transformed by strange accidents and careful work. Technology was also reshaping itself, not from mold, but from tiny circuits and glowing displays. A device that began as a bulky machine on a desk eventually shrank into our pockets and gave rise to the digital world. The first big leap came from something as humble as a calculator. The calculator that sparked the digital revolution. If you grew up thinking of calculators as cheap plastic things tossed in the back of a school bag, it may be hard to picture a time when owning one was something to brag about. But in the 1960s and early 70s, the calculator was closer to a luxury item than a classroom tool. It didn't come free in your phone, because phones weren't even electronic yet. Back then, the calculator sat at the cutting edge of consumer technology, and for a while, it carried the same sense of status that an expensive smartphone does today. The earliest commercial electronic calculators were giants compared to what we know now. One model, the Anita Mark 8, was roughly the size of a typewriter and was tethered to the wall socket like a small appliance. It was packed with vacuum tubes, glass chambers that shuttled electrons along filaments in order to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. These machines gave users the power to compute without pencil and paper, but with the cost of constant humming, heat, and bulk. The room would glow faintly from the tubes, and if anything went wrong, a burnt-out filament had to be replaced, much like changing a fragile light bulb. And the cost wasn't limited to electricity. These calculators carried price tags that rivaled that of a new car. Business offices or universities might spring for one to cut down on accounting time, but the average household couldn't dream of making the purchase. Calculators weren't yet attached to learning or homework, but instead were serious tools for big companies, banks, and engineers working with large data sets. To see a calculator in use during those years was to see the future, just as owning an early personal computer in the 80s made you ahead of the curve. Anyone who had one could expect co-workers or visiting client to ask for a demonstration, much like showing off a new piece of consumer tech today. The turning point came with a change inside the machine itself. Vacuum tubes were delicate, slow to respond, and huge. The arrival of the transistor changed all of that. A transistor was smaller, sturdier, and could act as an on and off switch for electrons with much less energy involved. Swapping hundreds of tube chambers for neat rows of transistors transformed what kind of device could be built. Circuits that once sprawled across several shelves of equipment could now fit on a tabletop. The effect on calculators was immediate, shrinking them from desk monsters to portable boxes. Then, engineers went one step further, with the integrated circuit. Instead of soldering transistor, after transistor into a tangle of wires, an entire circuit could be etched onto a single slice of semiconductor. That shift, pioneered in the late 1950s, was the real engine behind miniaturization. Texas Instruments, investing heavily in this technology, created a prototype in 1965 named Caltech. Roughly the length of a paperback book, its chip contained the equivalent of thousands of transistors. Though primitive by today's standards, it could add, subtract, multiply, and divide on demand. It even printed results on a tiny roll of tape using a thermal printer. Compared to a desk-sized calculator using dozens of vacuum tubes, this was a pocket miracle of engineering. Of course, pocket was a relative term. Early versions of the portable calculators were bulky, power-hungry, and expensive. But the breakthrough was undeniable. Within a decade, dozens of companies jumped into the race to sell smaller, cheaper, more efficient calculators. The competition pushed innovations not just in circuits, but also in display technology. The first screens were small red LED panels that glow like miniature neon signs. They were stylish but drained power, forcing calculators to carry heavy battery packs. That limitation led to another revolution: liquid crystal displays. LCDs were radically different. The molecules inside could act like a liquid in some ways, flowing and flexible, while maintaining a crystalline structure that responded to electric signals. This strange in-between state allowed them to bend light, blocking or revealing numerals without having to generate glow themselves. The result was a cool black-on-gray display that used minimal power. A calculator can now run on a single watch battery instead of needing packs or chargers. LCDs weren't just a gimmick. They made calculators light, portable, and truly pocket-ready. This same display technology quickly found its way into digital wristwatches and eventually to laptops, clocks, and smartphones, still using improved LCDs today. The snowball didn't stop there. Integrated circuits developed for calculators became the foundation of the microchip industry. Every advance in shrinking circuits and controlling energy consumption spilled over into computing. By the late 70s and early 80s, microchips originally designed to compute sums were powering the earliest desktop computers. Those evolved into personal computers, gaming consoles, and by extension the global internet and AI-driven devices of 2025. If you trace the chip inside your phone back through history, the line runs through the calculator boom of the 60s and 70s. That boom also influenced consumer culture. In the early years, people treated calculators as luxury gadgets. Stories from the time describe students carrying calculators to class as though they were rare jewels, admired and envied. Schools debated whether to even allow them on exams. One top-of-the-line calculator could cost as much as a family car, and owning one gave the same sense of prestige someone might get today from showing off the latest smartphone upgrade. Within a generation, though, those prices began to collapse. By the 80s, smaller factories in Asia could mass-produce calculators cheaply, which meant almost anyone could afford one. By the 90s, they were handed out free at banks or tucked into cereal promotions. Today, calculators exist as apps you can download for free, tucked invisibly into any phone. The long journey from desk-sized heaters to a line of code mirrors the larger electronics revolution itself. From rare object to universal tool, it's almost comic to think about the bragging rights early calculator owners carried. Imagine telling someone in 1971 that soon, people would have machines millions of times more powerful in their pockets, and they'd spend most of their time using them to scroll social media and send emojis. Yet, without calculators serving as the first wide platform for integrated circuits and LCDs, that path might not have unfolded so quickly. The calculator may look humble now, but it prepared the mass market for consumer electronics. The shift from niche tool for scientists to ordinary pocket machine mirrored the larger shift that computers would later follow, from oversized technical equipment to universal household necessity. So calculators weren't just about math homework. They popularized two of the most important technologies of the 20th century, the microchip and the flat panel display. Those two inventions rippled through every device you touch in 25, from your car to your laptop to artificial intelligence running in cloud servers. The story of calculators is, in a sense, the story of how electronics left the lab and entered daily life. But not all revolutions happen in circuits and glass screens. At the same time technology was reorganizing data, biology was being reprogrammed too. Scientists were beginning to uncover the idea that inside every living cell was its own kind of code, packed tighter and hidden deeper than any microchip. And when that code was cracked, it started to reveal answers to some of medicine's toughest questions. The calculator introduced us to computing. DNA introduced us to life's secret instructions, cracking the code of disease. Before modern genetic sequencing, tracking the cause of illness was more guesswork than precision. Doctors in the late 1800s and early 1900s had only basic microscopes, crude cultures, and a lot of assumptions to guide them. Diseases were labeled based on immediate appearance, and often the wrong culprit was blamed for an outbreak. Patients might be treated aggressively for something they didn't even have, because doctors could only match symptoms to known microbes without being able to confirm much else. That uncertainty carried serious risks. A single misidentification could lead to useless vaccines, bad treatments, and years of wasted scientific effort. Robert Koch tried to bring order to this confusion. His postulates set up a framework to connect a specific germ to a specific disease. The rules were clear. If an organism really caused an illness, then it had to be found in every single sick patient, and never in a healthy one. It had to be grown in a pure culture, and when introduced into another host, cause the exact same illness. Finally, it had to be isolated in the second case and remain unchanged. On paper, it was a neat map of cause and effect. In practice, though, these rules work better for bacteria than for anything smaller. Viruses, which rely on host cells to reproduce, didn't fit the mold. Scientists pushing Koch's framework onto conditions they didn't fully understand sometimes reached the wrong conclusions. One of the most telling examples was influenza. In 1892, a bacterium called Haemophilus influenza was declared the cause of the flu. It was visible under microscopes, could be grown in cultures, and seemed to fit Koch's postulates. Vaccines were even developed against it despite the lack of real evidence that it caused influenza. For decades, that assumption held, shaping public health in ways that did little against yearly waves of sickness. It wasn't until 1933, when researchers experimented with ferrets, that the truth emerged. The sick animals only became infected when exposed to filtered samples containing a virus, not Haemophilus influenza. Influenza was in fact viral, and whole decades of work targeting the wrong microbes suddenly collapsed under one key observation. This wasn't a rare mistake. It reflected the limits of an era. The diagnostic tools were simply not ready to measure anything smaller than bacteria in clear detail. Without advanced optics, without the ability to parse microscopic genetic code, scientists relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They applied frameworks that seemed logical but weren't universal, and often whole research fields needed to be torn down and rebuilt when future generations proved an earlier conclusion wrong. Those missteps may sound frustrating now, but they paved the way for more rigorous methods. Every false lead reminded researchers that disease can hide behind appearances and that accurate tools matter more than intuition. Fast forward to 2025 and the landscape looks entirely different. With genetic sequencing, a single swab can now reveal the identity of a pathogen within hours. Scientists don't have to wait on weeks of culturing, nor do they need to test disease transmission by passing it from host to host. Instead, sequencing machines read out the RNA or DNA directly, flagging the unique genetic fingerprints of viruses, bacteria, or fungi. Tools that once filled whole laboratories have been miniaturized enough to function in mobile clinics, airports, even field tents in outbreak zones. Where Koch's postulates relied on visual presence and culture growth, modern methods look directly into the molecular blueprint itself. The contrast is stark. During the COVID-19 pandemic, genetic sequencing allowed scientists to identify new variants in days. Researchers could watch mutations appear in near real time and warn health systems to prepare. That level of responsiveness simply wasn't possible a century earlier. In the past, confirming a new strain could demand weeks of animal testing, often infecting ferrets or mice to see if an illness could be transmitted. Vaccines and treatments lag dangerously behind outbreaks. By 2025, the workflow is completely different. Machine learning algorithms sort vast amounts of sequence data, spot patterns of mutation, and even predict potential evolutionary paths before they occur. Health officials can map outbreaks with the kind of precision early doctors could never dream of. What once required cages of animals now runs on racks of servers. The genetic code, once a hidden text, is read daily by machines trained to pick out errors, mutations, and hidden motifs. Humor lies. In the contrast, decades ago, scientists needed a ferret sniffing in a cage to prove influenza was viral. Today we need artificial intelligence sitting in a supercomputer cluster to track subtle genetic changes across continents. Both approaches aim to solve the same puzzle, but their scale and accuracy sit worlds apart. The progression from live animals to algorithmic modeling shows just how far medicine has shifted toward data-driven precision. The value of these tools isn't just speed for its own sake. Sequencing has shifted healthcare toward precision medicine. Instead of giving one-size-fits-all treatments, doctors can determine exactly which pathogen strain is at play and choose therapies tailored to that target. Antibiotic resistance, for example, can be identified from a patient's infection sample in a matter of hours. That avoids wasted prescriptions and prevents further strengthening of resistant bacteria. Cancer treatments, too, now draw from sequencing insights. Tumor biopsies are routinely tested for genetic mutations so therapies can zero in on vulnerabilities rather than relying on blunt, generalized methods. The same fundamental sequencing that started with pathogens has spread across nearly every branch of healthcare. It's worth remembering that this level of sophistication rests directly on the mistakes of earlier eras. Misidentifying influenza as bacterial may seem like a blunder, but the determination to correct that mistake built sturdier frameworks for proof. Koch's postulates laid the first stepping stones, even if viruses broke the rule set. The decades of confusion revealed that science had to keep pace with organisms too small and elusive for available tools. Those lessons prepared scientists to embrace sequencing when it finally appeared on the horizon. Every misstep, from wrongly blamed bacteria to flawed vaccines, carried a cost in lives and wasted effort. Yet each one added urgency to the push for accuracy. Today, when we can sequence a pathogen from a minor outbreak and build a targeted strategy in the same week, we are seeing the payoff of those long struggles. The torch has passed from cultured plate to sequencer, from animal cages to AI clusters, and from broad assumptions to detailed genetic maps. Still, scientific progress isn't only about refining laboratory methods. Sometimes real breakthroughs came from people looking outside the microscope and into the streets themselves. One 19th century doctor ignored and dismissed in his own era became one of the first to prove how environment and data could expose a hidden path of disease. The tool he used wasn't a sequencer or a ferret. It was a map, and one water pump that changed the future of public health. The map that stopped cholera in the mid-19th century. London was not the postcard vision people often imagine when thinking of Victorian Britain. The population had surged, streets were overcrowded, and the city was drowning in its own waste. Sewage overflowed from cesspools in the basements, refuse piled along alleyways, and the River Thames carried a constant flow of contamination. Drinking water was often drawn directly from the same rivers and wells polluted by human activity. In this environment, cholera thrived. Outbreaks swept through neighborhoods in days, killing hundreds with agonizing speed. Modern sanitation systems had not yet arrived, and public health theory at the time pointed to invisible clouds of miasma, or poisoned air, as the source of the disease. Most medical authorities insisted cholera floated through the atmosphere, striking wherever the stench of waste was strongest. One London doctor, John Snow, was not convinced. Trained in medicine, but also deeply curious about how diseases spread, he began to suspect that cholera traveled not through air, but through something far more direct: contaminated water. At a time when most of his colleagues accepted miasma theory as fact, Snow's ideas seemed far-fetched. Water looked clean enough to the eye, and germs too small to be seen weren't part of accepted science yet. But Snow trusted observation. During the outbreaks near his home in Soho, he noticed patterns that foul air couldn't explain. Families sharing the same pump fell ill together, while households blocks away, breathing the same air but drinking from different wells, often remained untouched. The clues were subtle but impossible to ignore. In 1854, his theory met its ultimate test. A sudden explosion of cholera cases struck Soho, killing more than 500 people within days. Snow traced the outbreak to one source, a public water pump on Broad Street. To prove it, he walked door to door, conducting interviews with survivors, mapping their locations, and recording whether they had used that specific pump. The evidence formed a chilling pattern. Nearly every case clustered around houses that relied on Broad Street's water. When he inspected the well, Snow found the water cloudy, containing white specks of organic waste. To him, this was the smoking gun. Yet convincing authorities was another challenge. Health officials believed foul odors were enough explanation. Snow's insistence on an unseen contaminant in the water was brushed aside as theoretical. Still, with evidence mapped on paper and case histories in hand, he presented his findings to local officials. Reluctantly, they agreed to an unusual experiment, removing the handle from the Broad Street pump. Once people could no longer draw water there, the number of new cholera cases quickly began to drop. It was not proof enough for the General Board of Health, which still clung to miasma theory, but it was undeniable in the streets of Soho, whatever had poisoned Broad Street's water was taken out of circulation, and the outbreak eased. Snow pressed further. He broadened his investigations across London, studying which water suppliers fed which districts. Some households received water drawn upstream of the city, while others drank from sources downstream, after thousands of gallons of sewage had been dumped in. When he compared cholera deaths across these neighborhoods, the numbers were shocking. Houses on downstream water had 14 times more deaths than those drinking cleaner upstream sources. The pattern fit his theory perfectly and provided powerful evidence that water, not air, carried the infection. Even with this data, the medical establishment remained reluctant. The idea that contaminated drinking water, invisible to the naked eye, could carry a deadly illness seemed unscientific to many leading authorities. But Snow's work planted the seeds of a new discipline. His outbreak maps, built from interviews and neighborhood surveys, became models for what would later be called epidemiology, the study of how diseases move through populations. He did not just claim a theory. He brought tangible data, plotted it, and used it to argue for practical interventions. The removal of that pump handle is remembered as a turning point. In reality, the outbreak was already waning when officials acted, but the symbolic act carried weight. It represented the idea that disease could be stopped not by treating individual patients once infected, but by cutting off the source of exposure. That concept would echo through later centuries, shaping vaccination campaigns, contact tracing, and environmental health. From a single contaminated pump, the foundation for public health strategy was laid. Today, the tools look very different, but the principles unchanged. In 2025, when a new outbreak emerges, investigators do not rely solely on hand-drawn maps. They deploy digital dashboards that can track infections in near real time, with data uploaded from clinics and labs around the globe. Sophisticated GIS software overlays maps of population density with infection rates and predicted spread pathways. During the COVID-19 pandemic, these dashboards became household resources, letting millions of ordinary people check case numbers by county every morning. Snow had to draw points with ink. Now artificial intelligence models trace entire pandemics across continents before an outbreak fully takes hold. The irony is that Snow himself operated with almost no technology. No microscope powerful enough to see viruses, no sequencing machines, and no acceptance of germ theory. His entire campaign rested on interviews, shoe leather, and notebooks filled with addresses and water habits. To picture it another way, he didn't fight with scalpels or syringes. His tools were paperwork, puddle water, and the stubborn refusal to accept what the establishment took for granted. It was hardly glamorous work. Snow trudged through neighborhoods, asking grieving families what pump they drank from, then turned their answers into a sheet of dots on a map. Yet those dots built the groundwork for the science of disease tracking. If London had been cleaner, his insight might not have stood out, but the relentless mixing of sewage and drinking water exposed the mechanism clearly. Cholera served as a brutal, deadly marker that drew the lines on his maps into bold warnings. Snow was not celebrated immediately. Recognition came slowly, but history has upgraded his role from eccentric skeptic to founder of epidemiology. His insistence that disease had patterns, that data was evidence, and that maps could guide solutions marked the beginning of a method still in use worldwide. The payoff is immense. Every mobile phone alert about contaminated food recalls Snow's decision to chart water sources. Every heat map of infections during flu season shows the same reasoning he used in Soho, and every international response plan leaning on geographic models owes a debt to one man with a pencil and determination. Snow's hand removal has turned through time into the worldwide engine of modern outbreak control. Of course, while his insight saved thousands in the long run, the world wasn't done making catastrophic mistakes in medicine. If cholera revealed the power of environment and data to stop disease, other stories showed how misplaced confidence in chemistry or manufacturing could be just as deadly as contaminated pumps. In the coming years, well-meaning attempts at modern treatments would sometimes poison entire communities not with sewage, but with medicines themselves. When cough syrup became antifreeze, in 1937, American drugstores carried a medicine that promised to make fighting infection easier than ever. It was sweet, raspberry-flavored, and went down smoothly. Parents gave it to children, doctors prescribed it with confidence, and bottles of it traveled across the United States. But this syrup wasn't life-saving. It was lethal. The product, called Elixir Sulfanilamide, used a chemical solvent that, unbeknownst to nearly everyone at the time, was essentially the same ingredient we now find in antifreeze. What seemed like a harmless liquid to carry an antibiotic ended up killing more than 100 people in one of the worst drug disasters in U.S. history. The substance at the center of the crisis was diethylene glycol. It had a pleasant taste and dissolved sulfanilamide powder easily, making the medicine palatable for both children and adults. From the perspective of the chemist who formulated it, this seemed like a clever solution to a pharmaceutical problem. The goal was to take sulfanilamide, a promising drug against certain bacterial infections, and make it easier to ingest. Add flavoring, bottle it up, and label it clearly. The company behind it, S.E. Massengill of Tennessee, believed they had created a safe and marketable new product. What they had really made was a chemical cocktail that slowly destroyed kidneys and nervous systems. Victims who took the syrup often showed no immediate alarm. Early symptoms mimicked something mild, similar to drinking alcohol, slight dizziness, nausea, or drowsiness. But as the doses continued, their organs began failing. Kidneys in particular came under severe attack, leading to fluid buildup, crippling abdominal pain, and organ collapse. Families continued to administer the syrup faithfully because the instructions on the bottle said to keep giving it until improvement came. Improvement never came. By the time physicians realized something was wrong, dozens of patients had already succumbed. In the weeks that followed, the tally rose to at least 105 confirmed deaths, some of them young children whose parents had no reason to suspect the medicine was acting as poison. The disturbing truth is that nothing about the syrup was illegal at the time. The bottle was labeled honestly. It listed the antibiotic ingredient, the solvent, and the flavoring. That label met every regulatory standard of the era. There was no requirement to test new formulations for safety before selling them. Drug oversight in the 1930s was limited mostly to whether a product was misbranded or adulterated. In the case of Elixir sulfanilamide, it wasn't misbranded, at least not technically. The only actual legal violation was the use of the word elixir, which by definition required alcohol in the mixture. Since the product contained diethylene glycol instead, the government could only intervene on that minor labeling issue. The loopholes were so wide that a medicine could meet the letter of the law while quietly killing its consumers. Public outrage was immediate once the link between the syrup and death became clear. The Food and Drug Administration, still a young and limited agency in the 1930s, scrambled to pull the medicine off shelves as news reports spread. Inspectors seized bottles wherever they could find them, and pharmacists were instructed to stop dispensing it immediately. Families demanded answers, newspapers reported anguished stories of children lost to kidney failure, and lawmakers faced pressure to prevent anything like this from happening again. The deaths could not be reversed, but the loophole-ridden system that allowed them to happen soon collapsed under public scrutiny. What followed was one of the most important reforms in U.S. public health history. In 1938, Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, transforming the FDA into a far more powerful watchdog. The act required manufacturers to prove a drug's safety before selling it. Instead of only checking labels, the FDA gained the right to demand pre-market testing, inspect manufacturing facilities, and pull dangerous items from circulation before lives were lost. The entire philosophy of drug regulation changed. Rather than trusting companies to police themselves, the law formally shifted the burden onto them to demonstrate safety first. It was a turning point that reshaped not just pharmaceuticals in the United States, but influenced drug safety standards throughout the world. Looking at today's landscape, the difference is staggering. A new medication in 2025 is subjected to rigorous preclinical testing, first in controlled laboratory studies, then in animal models, and finally through multiple phases of human clinical trials. Each stage is designed to identify safety risks before the drug reaches the public. Even after approval, the system doesn't stop paying attention. Post-market surveillance monitors patient outcomes, logging any unexpected side effects into databases accessible to regulators, physicians, and researchers. It may feel slow and bureaucratic to wait years for new drugs to clear these barriers, but compared to the free-for-all of the 1930s, it is worth pausing on the sheer absurdity of the original disaster. Imagine trusting a raspberry-flavored syrup that, on a molecular level, was closer to car coolant than anything you would want near a sick child. The thought of swallowing antifreeze for a sore throat seems laughable now, but that's only because the rules born out of 1937 prevent it. Every expiration date, every line of caution text, and every drug trial that slows the arrival of a new medication is a shadow of the Elixir sulfanilamide victims. Public confidence in medicine exists precisely because such confidence was once so badly betrayed. The story also reminds us how progress often arrives trailing grief behind it. Without the fatalities, the push to give the FDA stronger powers might not have reached Congress. Without real human suffering, loopholes in the system could have persisted for another decade or more. Sometimes it takes tragedy before public momentum outweighs industry resistance. That is not a comforting truth, but it is one reflected again and again across the history of science and medicine. This disaster directly rewrote drug law forever. In its immediate wake, public trust shifted from assuming medicine was safe unless proven otherwise to expecting proof before release. That expectation still guides modern healthcare, shaping everything from experimental cancer treatments to over-the-counter cough remedies. The line is clear. The raspberry syrup that acted as antifreeze forced the United States to rethink medicine from the ground up. And yet, the safeguards created in the 1930s did not close the door to every drug catastrophe. Within just 2 decades, another pharmaceutical swept the world with glowing promises of safety and relief. It would not be a syrup this time, but a pill, marketed especially to expectant mothers. Instead of saving lives, it produced one of the darkest moments in medical history, leaving thousands of families facing tragedy. This miracle of chemistry would turn into a nightmare known around the world. Thalidomide, chemistry's cruel twist. When thalidomide first appeared on pharmacy shelves in 1957, it seemed like exactly the kind of pill modern life had been waiting for. Advertised in West Germany as an over-the-counter remedy for sleeplessness, anxiety, and above all morning sickness during pregnancy, it was hailed as a gentle alternative to harsher sedatives. The appeal was obvious at a time when women were expected to work through pregnancy without the support structures common today. Thalidomide promised relief from nausea and exhaustion without addictive risks. It slipped quickly into mainstream use, spread to dozens of countries, and became a staple recommendation for expectant mothers. Doctors prescribed it liberally, reassured that it produced less drowsiness compared to barbiturates, and was believed to be so safe it could be sold without prescription in some regions. But within just a few years, hospitals and clinics began to notice a terrifying pattern. Newborns were arriving with severe malformations, shortened or missing limbs, malformed hands and feet, damaged ears, and in extreme cases, brain and internal organ abnormalities. These were infants born to women who had taken thalidomide during early pregnancy. By 1960, the link between the miracle anti-nausea pill and these devastating defects was undeniable. The scope was staggering. Thousands of families across Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America were affected. Records suggest that roughly 40% of these infants died soon after birth, while survivors faced lifelong disabilities ranging from limited mobility to lost independence and basic care. What began as a hopeful innovation had turned into one of the darkest pharmaceutical disasters of the 20th century. The cause of the tragedy came down to molecular geometry. Thalidomide is what chemists call a chiral molecule, a type of chemical structure that comes in two mirror image forms, known as enantiomers. They are identical in composition, but different in three-dimensional shape, like left and right hands. In thalidomide's case, the R enantiomer offered the soothing, nausea-reducing effect that doctors sought. The S enantiomer, however, disrupted fetal development and caused catastrophic defects. At first, hope arose that the enantiomers could be separated in manufacturing, so only the safe R version would be delivered. Unfortunately, that was impossible inside the body. Human metabolism allows the two forms to interconvert, meaning even if a perfectly pure R-thalidomide pill were swallowed, the body itself would transform part of it into the harmful S form. There was no way to keep mothers free from exposure. This discovery reshaped how scientists thought about safety. Until then, molecular chirality had not been a priority in pharmaceutical development. Chemists knew chirality existed, but didn't anticipate how one mirror image form could have completely different biological effects, sometimes deadly ones. Thalidomide forced the medical world to confront the idea that understanding a molecule's geometry was as important as testing its chemistry. This was not just a minor correction. It was a deep rethinking of how drugs must be evaluated, especially for vulnerable populations like pregnant women. The tragedy also changed law and procedure. In 1962, the United States passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the single largest regulatory overhaul since the 1938 changes sparked by Elixir sulfanilamide. These amendments demanded that drug manufacturers prove safety and effectiveness before selling to the public. They required stricter evaluation of side effects in all groups, including pregnant women, and placed new emphasis on long-term observation, not just short-term relief. They introduced independent review boards to oversee clinical testing alongside requirements for transparency in results. Drug approval was no longer a handshake between company and regulator. It became a rigorous multi-phase process. The law has been credited with keeping thalidomide off U.S. shelves, sparing American families from the same level of disaster. The reach of these reforms extended globally. Guidelines developed in the wake of thalidomide influenced other national systems, eventually feeding into international frameworks that still govern drug testing in 2025. Every protocol that demands extended testing in pregnant animal models, every default to question a harmless over-the-counter medication, and every insistence on proving benefits against risk can be traced to the lessons of thalidomide. In many respects, the modern culture of drug skepticism demanding proof before acceptance was born when this pill failed catastrophically. It's not just policy that changed. The very practice of clinical trials was transformed. Randomized controlled studies became more common. Preclinical animal testing expanded to cover multiple generations and pregnancy exposures, and long-term toxicity tests became standard. The days of releasing a drug based only on short-term patient responses came to a close. Pharmaceutical companies learned, often painfully, that cutting corners now would not only devastate human lives, but also destroy public trust and invite ruinous legal battles. Thalidomide ushered in an era where safety oversight grew as important as innovation. Even so, this story is not one of pure abandonment. Thalidomide never vanished completely. Decades after it was withdrawn as an anti-nausea pill, scientists found uses for its complex chemistry that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Researchers discovered that thalidomide suppressed abnormal immune responses and reduced the formation of new blood vessels. That made it unexpectedly useful in fighting leprosy complications and treating multiple myeloma, a type of blood cancer that is still difficult to cure. By 2025, thalidomide is back on the market, but only under the tightest of restrictions. Its prescription is limited to strict monitoring programs, enforced pregnancy testing, and electronic registries that track every dose. It's an uneasy second life for a drug whose name still carries heavy historical weight. The bitter twist is unavoidable. A chemical that once promised comfort for pregnant women caused widespread suffering to newborns. Then, decades later, the same molecule returned as a controlled agent against some of the hardest diseases modern medicine faces. If it were a story written in fiction, critics might call it too contrived. Yet in the real world of molecular biology, it is exactly the kind of cruel, balanced science often produces. A so-called miracle pill ended up as chemistry's grimmest reminder that progress without caution is not progress at all. It's tempting to laugh at the irony. A pill pitched as harmless relief turned into the most destructive pharmaceutical mistake of its era. Thalidomide is one of those rare cases where the phrase plot twist almost feels literal. What started as a gesture of optimism in the 1950s spiraled into proof that even the smallest structural quirk of a molecule can make the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Few disasters have so clearly demonstrated that safety in medicine is not just about ingredients, but about geometry, metabolism, and the complexity of living systems. The legacy left behind is not just in hospitals or courtrooms, but in the global rules that still frame drug development today. Thalidomide taught scientists to respect molecular shapes, regulators to demand proof, and societies to ask harder questions before swallowing promises. It reshaped medicine from top to bottom, not by its success, but by its failure. That's why, whenever new drugs are tested under conditions that seem cautious or even tedious, thalidomide is still the unspoken reference point. Modern pharmaceutical ethics stand on the ruins it created. But not every story in medical history traces back to the disaster. Some breakthroughs came not through lab errors or tragic oversights, but through extraordinary human endurance. At a time when an isolated community faced death from a relentless disease, salvation had to come not from factories or laboratories, but from a relay of dogs and their drivers, braving storms and frozen tundra to carry medicine across impossible distances. That race for survival would become one of the most dramatic rescue missions in medical history, the Great Race of Mercy. In January of 1925, the small Alaskan town of Nome suddenly found itself facing a crisis that threatened the lives of nearly everyone within its frozen borders. The town's one physician, Curtis Welch, had begun seeing children come down with sore throats and fevers that worsened with frightening speed. He quickly recognized the signs: diphtheria. At the time, this bacterial infection carried a high fatality rate, especially among children. As the toxin spread through the body, it formed a thick membrane in the throat that could choke a patient to death, while also damaging the heart and nervous system. Nome's population of about 1,400 was already vulnerable due to isolation, and Welch knew he faced the impossible task of stopping an epidemic with almost no medicine. The only real treatment, diphtheria antitoxin, had run out. The closest supplies were hundreds of miles away in Anchorage. Normally, this would not have sounded insurmountable, but it was the middle of an especially brutal winter. Temperatures plunged to minus 45 degrees Celsius, and winds turned every open trail into a death sentence. Ships were trapped in sea ice, unable to move. The small bush planes of the 1920s were grounded. Open cockpits and primitive engines simply could not risk the volatile blizzards raging across Alaska. Nome, perched on the western edge of the Bering Sea, had essentially been cut off from the rest of the world. Inside the town, Dr. Welch quarantined patients and tried to prevent exposure, but he knew without antitoxin doses the outbreak could kill hundreds. The solution was as desperate as it was daring. Officials devised a plan to transport the serum by dog sled relay across more than 1,000 kilometers of frozen wilderness. The route stretched from Nanana, where the antitoxin could be unloaded by train, to Nome on the western coast. Ordinarily, mushers took up to a month to cover such ground. In this emergency, they had to do it in just a handful of days. 20 men volunteered to drive sleds, and about 150 sled dogs were assembled. The package they carried weighed less than 20 pounds, but its value was measured in entire lives. If they arrived too late, children already coughing in Nome's cabins would not survive. Every musher faced long hours in whiteout conditions. Icy winds whipped down from mountain passes, and frostbite turned exposed skin raw in seconds. Teams struggled through collapsing trails and hidden drifts beneath the snow. Leonard Sapala, one of Alaska's most skilled mushers, took the most dangerous portion. With his lead dog, Togo, he pulled the serum across the Northern Sound, where sea ice cracked and shifted beneath their paws. The winds off the water made the stretch one of the most perilous in the journey, but Sapala pressed forward, covering nearly 145 kilometers in a single leg of the relay. Many later credited this portion as the saving link that ensured the serum arrived at all. The last stretch fell to Gunnar Kajan and his team, led by Balto. Their run began in another snowstorm, with gusts strong enough to knock sleds sideways and obliterate all visibility. Carlson reportedly could not even see his lead dog most of the time, forcing Balto to guide the sled largely by instinct over trails the musher could not confirm. Against the odds, they reached Nome in the early hours of February 2nd, just 5 days and 7 hours after the first musher left Nanana. What should have taken weeks had been completed in less than a week. The serum was delivered frozen but intact, and Welch immediately began administering it to the most severe cases. The timing could not have been tighter. Just as the first deaths were being recorded, the life-saving doses prevented diphtheria from sweeping unchecked across the town. Only 5 residents ultimately died in the outbreak, a far smaller toll than Welch had feared. The story of the relay spread quickly through newspapers across the United States. 4 weeks after, Balto and the other dogs were celebrated as heroes, and mushers found themselves household names. But beyond dramatic headlines, the run sparked something more enduring. The near disaster showed the need for accessible medicines and organized networks of delivery, even in the most remote corners of the country. In the decades that followed, the Great Race of Mercy left a cultural and scientific mark. Diphtheria vaccination campaigns expanded across the country, eventually producing dramatic declines in cases nationwide. In the 1920s, tens of thousands of American children died every year from diphtheria. By the middle of the century, vaccines pushed the disease into near extinction in the United States, and by 2025, only a handful of cases occur each decade. The serum run was not just a story of heroic dogs and mushers. It was the alarm that spurred a broader public health commitment to prevention. The legacy also lives on in sport. To honor the feat, Alaskan organizers created the Iditarod Trail sled dog race. Every year, mushers and their teams cover a route modeled on the serum run, stretching across snow, mountains, rivers, and wind-scoured flatlands. What began as a desperate relay is now a celebration of endurance and a community tradition. Statues of Balto stand in cities far from Alaska, reminders of the cold journey that prevented the community's collapse. Togo, who actually ran the toughest leg, has likewise gained recognition in more recent years as history sought to rebalance the credit. Seen from 2025, though, the serum run is also a contrast to the present. Today, global logistics networks can move vaccines across continents in days, monitoring precise cold chain containers that keep doses usable from factory to remote clinic. Planes span oceans, refrigerated trucks cross deserts, and even drones can bring doses to villages hours away from the nearest road. While Nome's residents once waited in terror for 5 days as dogs crossed the tundra, today a medical crisis triggers supply chains that react worldwide. The difference highlights not only technological growth, but also how much of modern systems are built on responses to earlier emergencies. Today, we equate fast delivery with overnight shipping for consumer goods. In 1925, keeping medicine on time meant teams of heavily bundled men and their dogs plunging into minus 45-degree storms with a wooden sled. That was public health's express system. Yet the outcome was the same goal, getting a life-saving treatment to people before it was too late. The serum run's influences felt every time disaster response protocols are rehearsed, every time vaccines are pre-positioned near outbreak zones, and every time technology ensures rural communities are not left behind. Noam's frozen panic gave shape to the principle that emergencies demand speed, coordination, and sacrifice. The world learned how much difference a few days can make between catastrophe and survival, not from charts or laboratories, but from dogs breaking trail through ice. The Great Race of Mercy was not just a battle for one town, but a marker of how humanity builds systems from the edge of disaster. The odd history of science is full of reckless ideas that somehow became the groundwork for progress. From government-fed poisons to radioactive tonics, unsafe drug trials, and accidents with mold, each step carried enormous risk for those involved. These people endured illness, injury, and sometimes death, not because safety was assured, but because safety didn't exist yet. The uncomfortable reality is that today's protections, labels on food, consent in medicine, standards in technology were written in response to those sacrifices. Next time you trust a pill, safe milk, or the processor in your phone, remember it came at someone else's cost.